Hi, this is Karen. We're here at Montavilla Sewing Center and we're talking about the Bernette b38. Today we're going to talk about the utility stitches, which is in mode 1 called direct, and they call that direct because you can go directly to the stitch you want, the picture that you want, press that and you're automatically into that stitch. When you first turn on your machine, of course, it's going to be in a straight stitch. Now I want to let you know that the way this works is similar to many Janome machines. So if you have a machine that basically works this way, the stitches are going to be basic this way too. Now, so for stitching straight stitch, of course I already mentioned this, your machine will wake up as a perfect straight stitch, central needle position, nice stitch length for garment stitching. You can shorten or lengthen that if you want to. Number 2 here, says 2 right there, that just moves your needle off to the side. You still have the same stitch length, but that just makes a quick way to move your needle off to the left. Stitch number 3, now that's kind of an interesting stitch. What that does is takes 2 stitches forward and then 1 stitch back. And what that does is gives you a stretchy stitch. I'll show you. So, for instance, I'll use a piece of denim. Doesn't stretch much at all, but on the bias it does. So in certain areas of your garment, you want to have a little more stretch there and some more strength. So I'll show you what that looks like. And see, going really slow, you can see how it goes 2 stitches forward and 1 stitch back. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch that. It's putting 3 times as much thread into your seam. So it's going to be a nice strong stitch, and it's going to stretch with your garment. Really good for the back crotch seam of pants and also the back of your armholes too. Okay, stitch number 4 is similar to that. What it does is it gives you a stretch stitch but doesn't put quite as much thread into your fabric, and it's good for knits. So watch slowly as it goes. Takes a stitch forward and then to the side. So it's kind of like a bent zigzag. And notice I'm using the cutter button here to both lift the needle and to cut the threads. And see how the threads are just these nice short little tails on the back. That's also going to stretch, not quite as sturdy as the triple stitch here, but still a serviceable stretchy stitch. And then your good old zigzag, which is good for a lot of different kind of sewing. Zigzag, when you select 5, the zigzag is going to give you a standard width, 3.5, and a standard length. You can change both of those. You can make this as wide as you want, up to 7 millimeters, and you can shorten your stitch length or lengthen your stitch length. I'm going to make it as long and as wide as it goes. And when the machine gives you that quick beep, that means it's to the limit of what it can do. Some of the stitches on this machine, you've got a lot of stitches. Some of the stitches have a limit as to how wide or how narrow, and some decorative stitches you cannot adjust at all because it would change the shape of, say, that snowflake you're doing. So I adjusted this to make it as wide and as long as it goes. And I'll show you what this looks like. Watch the needle here and you'll see it makes a locking stitch right at the beginning. That's how it does on the zigzag all the time. And if you want to, you can do a locking stitch at the end. Just push that button. You don't need to hold it. It just does a locking stitch right there like that. And keep your foot on the pedal until it's done. Then you can use the cutter button. Of course, you can always take your fabric out and cut the threads with scissors or use the thread cutter on the side here. So that is a nice big bold zigzag. You can also do a very short narrow one if you want. Let's go back to default right there. I'm going to make it much narrower and much shorter. This would be really helpful if you were doing, say, satin stitch around an applique. Now I'll just kind of guide it around here. Now if we want to take a look at our stitches, leave your needle down, lift up your presser foot, turn it to the side. Oh, I think I want to make it a little bit wider, so I'll make it a little bit wider. There we go. And there we go. Made that stitch wider. So this time I'm going to show you the thread cutter, so I'll just lift up my needle. And notice I didn't have to use that hand wheel at all for this. We can just use the needle up, needle down button here, and it puts the needle up at the highest position. Another nice thing about any machine that has the needle up, needle down feature, when your machine stops, it will stop with either the needle all the way down or all the way up. It's not ever in between. Another application for zigzag would be to seal the edge of your fabric so it doesn't continue to fray. When you sew a garment and you wash that garment, you don't want to have your seam allowance fraying away. So I'm going to go back to regular zigzag width, and since this is a more loosely woven fabric, we want to increase our stitch width. Let's go up to about 5 there, like that. This is just a regular piece of cotton denim. Start stitching. And just make sure that the right hand swing of the needle goes past the edge of the fabric. Now I'm going to show you a really neat feature on this machine. If we wanted to do a locking stitch, for one thing, you want to make sure you're doing the locking stitch on the fabric, not out in the air, or else it just kind of twists up the thread, doesn't really form a knot. But it will form a knot if it's stitched into the fabric. But let's say we wanted to combine our locking stitch and the cutter, so we don't have to push both of those buttons, we can just push one. If you press and hold this button, see that little scissor appears? Now when we do our locking stitch, press that, keep our foot down on the pedal until it stops completely. You heard that? That is the machine cutting the threads for you. Leaves that little short thread tail, and there you go. So the way you would turn that off is you just press and hold this. Now this only will work if you're doing like the locking stitch. If you do a reverse stitch, it won't automatically cut your threads for you. Okay, if you look carefully, you can see that the threads meet past the edge of the fabric. That's going to prevent this from continuing to fray. And that's what you want to do when you have fabric that frays easily. You don't really need to do that with knits, of course. Now, let's go to another stitch here, and that is stitch number 6. It's your 3-step zigzag. Nice thing about the 3-step zigzag is you can get a nice even flat edge when you are overcasting fairly thin fabric like this. It takes extra stitches, which means it's not going to go quite as fast as your regular zigzag, but it'll give you a nice flat seam. And another thing about the cutting button, it's best to do it when you're sewing over fabric like that. Okay, nice flat edge there. But what I really like about 6 is that you can use it for mending. So let's say you have a hole in a towel or something like that, and it's kind of gotten a little frayed, okay, out of washing and stuff like this. What we want to do is shorten this stitch length to make that a denser stitch. So I'm going to go right down the middle. Of course, normally we would have matching thread and matching fabric, but for demo purposes here, we're using contrast thread so you can see what I'm doing. So it starts out with a locking stitch. And I'm going right across that, right along the cut in the fabric. Go right to the end. Now, I'm going to just turn it around, sew back over it gently. And you can, of course, do this as many times as you feel like you need to get a good mend on the fabric. I will advise you, though, if you're sewing a towel, you don't want to do too much or else it kind of flattens the little loops on the terry towel. So let's do that little trick that I talked about before. Press and hold this. Press this once, keep your foot down on the pedal. It will do the locking stitch and cut the threads for us. A nice sturdy mend. With a really frayed hole, you might want to put a backing fabric behind there, but that's a great use for the 3-step zigzag. Now the Stitch number 7 is genius, and you will see why. So, if you're garment constructing, you're probably going to be using a back stitch quite a bit. This builds in the back stitch at the beginning, and then when you tell it to, it'll do it at the end. So I will demonstrate. So let's say we want to do a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Make sure you're sewing on the fabric. Don't start here off the fabric. Make sure it's on the fabric. And start sewing. Now watch what it does. I didn't have to press the back stitch button. It had it in there automatically. So when I'm doing my stitching, I want to make sure I'm watching right here to get a nice straight seam allowance. And then I'm going to go down to here, stop about a 1/4 inch from the edge, push this, but you don't have to hold it. So I'm keeping my foot down on the pedal, and there it is, it stopped. Cut this. The beauty of this stitch, it gives you a nice, accurate, even back stitch. Here is where I started, and here is where I stopped and pressed the back stitch button. So that is a wonderful stitch. Also, you can move your needle position to one side or the other. You can lengthen or shorten this stitch just like you would with stitch number 1. That's stitch number 7. Stitch number 8. Now one thing you might want to notice is up here on the little screen, it tells you what foot to use. So far, we've just been using foot A. This stitch calls for foot C. Looks a little bit different. Has a couple little wires there, and that's because this stitch has some width to it, and the wires help keep some slack in the thread so that it stitches without curling up the edge of your fabric. What this stitch will do is stitch your seam and overcast the edge all in one step. So I'm going to show you again. I already did one of them, but I'm going to show you again what this looks like. It's really a cool stitch. And it gives you a fairly narrow seam, less than a 1/4 inch. So what we want to do is place our stitch, our fabric, right here next to this little black flange right there. That's going to be your guide. Also, if you look where you're sewing, you can see that the edge of the fabric is even with that right-hand wire. Now, the needle is not going to hit the wires because this stitch is set for this foot. So it's already going to be in the right place. As you're sewing, make sure you keep both edges of your fabric nice and even, and make sure that you watch right there so that your fabric is just in the right place. And it should stay in the right place because that acts like a guide. It does your locking stitch. There's also some back and forth motion of this stitch, so it's going to give you a little more stretch in that area. Nice for finely woven things that are on the bias, where you need to have almost a sheer seam. Okay. And at the end, we're just going to stop and cut the thread. And the last couple of stitches sometimes get stuck on, especially if you haven't used the cutter, if you just pull it out. The wires are connected on the front of the foot, but not on the back, so you can slide your stitches off the back if you need to. But isn't that a beautiful seam? And it's normal to have it a little bit, the overcast a little bit pulled towards the back. The main thing is what you have is a nice sturdy seam that's overcast on the edge. So that's stitch number 8. For stitch number 9, that's a blind hem stitch. And we have a video on how to do that on a different machine. You can look on our YouTube channel for that. Also, that's the same thing for the buttonhole stitch. We have a video on that, and it's the same procedure, different machine, same procedure. Also, if you look in your little guide that you find under here, we have a mending stitch, and that's also explained on one of our videos, as well as the bar tack stitch. And the bar tack would be what you'd use on the tops of pockets or something to kind of reinforce that top edge. So that's your utility stitches on the Bernette B38. take a look at some of our other videos, and if you enjoyed this video and if it was helpful to you, give us a thumbs up. And if you have comments or questions, you can leave them in the box down below. Thank you for watching. See you later. Bye.